Thank you, dear. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's 7:30. I'm Jerry Zieler, the chairman. I often forget to say that, just in case you wonder who this bloke is. And you're very, very welcome. It's a Charles Close Society meeting, but there may well be members of British Cartographic Society and INCOS here this evening, in which case you're very welcome as well. And before I introduce our speaker, Keith Lilley, just like to give you a little bit of news. We have some events coming up which you might like to be reminded of. They will be in the e-newsletter if you get that, and some of them are in the latest copy of Sheetlines. But we've got, after this talk in May and June, there'll be John Cruikshank speaking to us at the AGM next month in Grantham, to which I hope you're all coming. And Rob would have me say, if not, why not? But that's on the 11th of May, and John Cruikshank is talking about the evolution of Soviet topographic maps as shown by their own Soviet documentation. The next event is a walk, which we haven't had for some time. Another excellent walk is planned by John King. We're limited to 20 people. We're very nearly there, but you're welcome if you sign up quickly by dropping me an email, chairman@charlesclosesociety.org. And John is leading a walk around the interesting back streets around St. James's Park. That's the Westminster side of the park, of course. And it's finished off by a lunch, which I can reveal is in a pub that's full of maps. The other event I wanted to talk to you about, and it looks very probable now, but I still don't have final confirmation, 25th of June, we're having a society visit to Dennis Maps, the printers of many surveys maps in Frome, in sunny Somerset, to which there are trains from London at about 9 o'clock in the morning from Waterloo, if anyone's interested. If you're not a Londoner, you don't care. But we're looking forward to confirming that very, very shortly. And finally, saying to Aaron just now, we're going to have another live London show and tell meeting in Highgate, probably June and July. I haven't fixed the date yet, but you're very welcome to that. So that's enough news, I think. Finally, if anyone's interested in the Honour Survey of Ireland, keep in touch, keep an eye on your newsletters, or drop me an email, because we're about to be selling a book by Finian O'Connor, who is a qualified land surveyor with an interest in the early history of the profession. And his new book is called The Origin of Ireland's Ordnance Survey, Taxation, Townlands and Topography. It'll be £30. There are some copies of his previous book, which I can't yet offer, but I might have a few of, at only £15 a copy, and that's called Land Surveying in Ireland, 1690 to 1830. Those are both books by Finian O'Connor, and published in Ireland, but those are English prices. And keep an eye open for those in the coming days and weeks. I think that's enough from me. I would like to now introduce, if you didn't know him already, our very own member, Professor Keith Lilley, who's a historical geographer at Queen's University, Belfast, in the Department of Geography. His teaching and research focuses on maps and landscapes and straddles history, geography, and archaeology. He has led map-based research projects for over 3 decades, and yet he looks so young, exploring the landscapes of medieval towns and cities, including Chester, Swansea, and Coventry. As well as a member of CCS, he's formerly chair of the Historic Towns Trust, through which he's still closely involved with the British Historic Towns Atlas programme led by the HTT. In 2018, he received the Cuthbert Peak Award from the Royal Geographical Society for advancing geographical knowledge through the application of contemporary methods, including GIS and mapping. He's kindly offered to answer questions. Can we have those after, please? Or if you're busting to answer it, raise a hand or put your question in the chat facility, which is bottom leftish on your screen. And I will keep an eye open on that, Keith, while we go through, and we can address those points afterwards. Or if it's bustingly urgent, perhaps we may interrupt you for a moment, or I will. But with all of that said and done, it's a very warm welcome to everyone here, and particularly to Keith. And thank you, Keith, for going. He's going to give us a fantastic show. It's fantastically mappy, and he has noticed it's Shakespeare's birthday as well as George's Day. Over to you, Keith.
Great, thanks very much, Jerry, and thank you everybody for giving up your Tuesday evening on St. George's Day and Shakespeare's birthday, as you say, Jerry. So I do really appreciate it, and this is going to be a topic which is something which is very very close to my heart, and takes me back to my roots quite literally as a Coventrian. You're going to see a little bit of Coventry in here. Coventry's already been mentioned. And maybe a slightly different sort of approach to thinking about large-scale maps of the Ordnance Survey. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, if that's okay with everybody. I'll just give that a go now. Here we go. And I'm hoping that will be visible to all who are gathered. Is that right?
Slideshow and
yeah. All good?
Lovely, thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, I'm just going to minimize everybody so I don't see you all. But do please shout out, especially if my internet starts giving up and starts getting a bit patchy. That has happened before. Anyway, so great to be here. Like I said, thank you for giving up your evening. And I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you about a topic, like I said, which is something which is very close to my heart and has been now, as Jerry was saying, 30 years, 3 decades. It's very kind of you to say I've worn it well. Might not feel it. So the title of the talk is, as you can see, Beneath the Lines. That's obviously the lines on the map, which we're looking at here. Beneath the Lines, mapping medieval townscapes using large-scale Ordnance Survey maps. And the choice of example on the title slide here is deliberate. It is, of course, Coventry. As you can probably tell, it says Coventry Barracks at the bottom there. Some of you may be familiar with some of the features of Coventry's Ordnance Survey map, the 25-inch scale map here. So, as Jerry was saying, my background is in geography. I'm an historical geographer. And I originally began my research back in the early 1990s as a PhD student at the University of Birmingham. And my PhD focus was on medieval Coventry. So that's why, again, this is sort of taking me back to my roots. And when I look at a large-scale OS, 25-inch sheet like we have before us here, we see different things in it, don't we, really? As we go, if we were to go around the room, so to speak, the virtual room here, everybody would look at that map and see something in it that may be of interest. It may be that you're interested in transport history. You might pick out the tramway wiggling its way through Broadgate. It might be that you're interested in industrial history. So you might start picking out features like, for example, engineering works and so on, of which, of course, there were many in Coventry in the late 19th and early 20th century. For me, as somebody interested in medieval urban landscapes, and this is sort of the focus really for me today, I kind of see through the map, the image of the map, to what lies beneath it, so to speak, beneath the lines. The lines I'm talking about are the lines like the lines representing streets, the lines representing buildings, and the lines representing plot patterns as well. So the lines on the map actually give us some, I think, really important insights into the origins and development of our medieval towns and cities, not only in the context of Britain, but also in other parts of Europe as well, in the equivalents to the Ordnance Survey large-scale maps like the one you have before you here. So this is what I'm going to explore with you today, actually this evening, is looking through the map image, so to speak, but thinking very much about what is on the map, to look a little bit about how these large-scale maps can say something of the origins and development of our medieval urban landscapes. And most of our towns and cities across these islands, in fact, Britain and Ireland, I'm speaking to you from Northern Ireland, most of our towns and cities really owe their origins, their urban origins, to the medieval period. It's a very important and influential period in terms of urban development. So let's move this on a bit then. So I'm very grateful to members and to the Charles Close Society and to friends joining us here. So I'm going to move us on to talk a little bit, first of all, about something which has really revolutionized things for us in the world of maps and the interest in the history of cartography. When I was working on Coventry on my PhD thesis back in the early 1990s, which I don't think is that long ago, really, although some of my students might argue otherwise. Back in the early 1990s, if one wanted to get hold of a large-scale map, like the one I've just shown you here, then it would be pretty, not necessarily an easy task, actually. You might write to the British Library in the olden days on a piece of paper and ask for a particular sheet to be reproduced. It would be reproduced photographically at size, at scale, and it would be sent to you in a rolled up in a tube, a cardboard tube, at some expense. And remember those days. I was fortunate at the University of Birmingham in the Department of Geography, right, doing my PhD, that I had Jamie Peart. Many of us will know Jamie, who's retired now as the map librarian in the Department of Geography at University of Birmingham back in those days. And Jamie had, of course, a very good collection of 25-inch sheets, especially for the county of Warwickshire and some other Midlands counties. But by and large, we had to go about the business of gathering our facsimiles of larger scale maps, especially not the small scale OS maps, which of course you could pretty much pick up in shops and so on, but certainly the larger scales, like the 25-inch, historic 25-inch maps, it required a little bit of work. What's happened in that intervening 30 years, of course, is a cartographic revolution. You'll see little quotations on these interim slides here of certain. I thought since it's Shakespeare's birthday, it would be only appropriate to maybe what I hope are a reasonably appropriate quotation in relation to the topics I'm talking about through the talk. So I thought I'd just start off with this issue, really. In many ways, the availability of our Ordnance Survey large-scale maps is now so different to us. We sort of perhaps even take it for granted. I know certainly my students probably do. The availability of historic large-scale OS maps, particularly through online web mapping applications. So the one which is perhaps always at our fingertips is the National Library of Scotland's website, which you see a little extract from here. The go-to place, really, if we're wanting to maybe have a look at a particular sheet, a particular scale, particular location. Chris Fleet at NLS and his colleagues have done wonders for us for democratizing what otherwise would have been sometimes quite challenging, difficult, hard to reach sources for our large-scale Ordnance Survey maps. So we have had a revolution, have we not, in access to these. And that, I think, provides us with a really, really important opportunity, not only as map historians, people interested in the Ordnance Survey, and maps and so on, and surveys we've just been hearing about, but also those interested in local history, in genealogy, in archaeology, in exploring our heritage, cultural heritage in different places. And for me, as somebody interested in the origins and development of medieval urban landscapes, it provides an opportunity to explore those using the Ordnance Survey map as a gateway into understanding our country's urban origins and developments going back into the medieval period. So what I want to do by the end of this talk is convince you all that we can do this. Not only that we can do it, but we probably should do it, because our towns and cities are in a constant state of change and flux, as they always have been. And some of what we see when we look out the window, when we walk down our streets in our towns and cities, owes its origins to 500, 800,000, maybe plus years. And using Ordnance Survey maps gives us some insights into the value, the cultural value of that medieval urban heritage. And also, maybe we're interested in understanding a little bit more about how our towns and cities came to be the way that they are today. So, thinking first of all about what we can do with maps. I mean, one of the things that NLS does really well, actually, is to provide this sort of ability to be able to compare maps, and whether it's comparing maps with modern aerial imagery or historic maps with other historic maps. So here we have a side-by-side from NLS, National Library of Scotland, for the 6-inch first edition, I think it is, for Summertown. And the later edition, you see the dates top there. So same location on both sides, but we can spot the difference. We can use maps to tell stories about how urban landscapes have changed over time. The maps themselves provide a window onto the past, a snapshot of the landscape at a particular point in time. Approximately speaking, of course, there's always going to be some nuances and subtle differences and so on within those sheets individually. But broadly speaking, you can look at Summertown on the left, which is the earlier map, compared to Summertown on the right, the later map, and spot the difference. And you begin to see the process of suburbanization here. This, hopefully you can see my little arrow moving just above where it says Sunnymead in the top right-hand corner. We have a new little road and development appearing there, Hearns Road, which on the earlier sheets, of course, is just still fields. So using maps like this is a very valuable sort of tool for understanding urban landscape change. We can begin to compare one map with another map, and we can use geographic information systems to layer up maps or put them side by side like this, and use the functionality, the tools of GIS to look at how landscapes have changed over time. So this works really well, obviously, for the 19th and 20th centuries, for those time periods for which the Ordnance Survey maps were surveyed and produced. But I'm going to take you back further in time, much before the 19th century, to the medieval period, to the period around from the 11th century through to about the 14th century, which is a really formative period in the development of urban landscapes, particularly for Britain. There were medieval maps in the medieval period. And so this is just an example. One of the fairly, I suppose, if we believe Paul Harvey, and why wouldn't we? He's very much expert in this sort of field. In his book, Maps of Tudor England, from a few years ago, writing in the England of 1500, maps were little understood or used. And I think that's probably still fairly widely accepted by historians, medieval historians, interested in maps and geography. And the example there of a plan of Christchurch, Canterbury, from around 1150 is an example, but perhaps a rare example, of the survival of a map from the 12th century. But what's interesting, you might say, well, it's not to scale, it looks more like a picture, it's not really a map, and so on. Historians have all those sorts of debates about these things. But what it actually shows, and its purpose really, was to help with the organization and implementation of a water system, which you can see here, connecting these little red lines here. These are the cisterns, these are the pipes, the little conduits for water to be channeled around the monastery. So there's a quite close relationship there between the map as a tool for planning, for development, for engineering purposes, in this case for hydraulic engineering, for water, for checking the locations of particular parts of a water system. So in the medieval period, there are other maps like the one on the left-hand side, a bit more exotic, the Tuscan example, which again relates to planning, actually, or at least that's the way in which it's often interpreted. I don't know if maybe you can make out what we're looking at here. Here's the sea. This is for Talamone. Here's the sea on this side. There's a circle of walls, which you can see here. and some towers in those walls. Some of this map is in planimetric form, so it's sort of top down, looking straight down to the Earth's surface, to the landscape. And some of it is more in perspective, like we have with the 12th century example here. So some of the buildings are shown as elevation rather than in plan view. But what's striking here is to me, is the layout of the streets, which you can see here, this grid of streets, these parallel streets. You can see it's in a volume because that's the crease, the fold at the center of the volume, in which it's kept. So there's a street running down the middle here, and these little oblongs here are plots or properties, tenements, if you like, the parcels which were being let out in the town for particular rent. And this map actually is part of that documentation relating to property within this town of Talamoni. But the possibility is also highly likely that this plan here was used to help in the organization and the laying out of this town. Talamoni was a new town in the medieval period. So again, it's a connection between maps of the medieval period on the right-hand side with Canterbury in terms of hydraulic engineering, and on the left-hand side in terms of perhaps town planning or the organization of the plan of the town itself using a map. And then, of course, documenting the release of properties. And the volume itself is in the archive of Siena, the town of Siena, of course, the city of Siena. So there are maps of medieval towns and cities, but they're relatively few and far between. They do exist, and there may have been many more of them back in the day. But if we're interested in trying to understand how we might use maps to map medieval urban landscapes, what we need to do is look to modern maps as a way of creating some sort of proxy for revealing the formation, the layout of medieval urban landscapes. And that's what I'm going to be talking through this evening with you, giving some examples from some of the work that I've been doing over the years, particularly Coventry, as has been mentioned, and Swansea as well will come up to this evening. Other places others have worked on, including Alnwick in Northumberland and Ludlow in Shropshire, and other points in between as well, as we go through, including Hull and York, they spring to mind. So what I'm talking about here is looking behind the map, using the Ordnance Survey large-scale map as a proxy to tell us something of medieval urban histories and the planning of medieval urban landscapes. So I hope you're enjoying the little quotations from the top right-hand corner there from Shakespeare. This background map, by the way, I'm sure many of you will recognize it, is from Swansea itself. So let's start looking behind the map. And to do this, I'm going to return to one of the key kind of contributors to a particular way of thinking about landscape as a palimpsest, the landscape as a record of its own evolution. And this is W.G. Hoskins writing in the 1950s in The Making of the English Landscape, that classic volume, which is still in print actually. So Hoskins wrote us, "The landscape is the richest historical record we possess. The landscape takes us back before maps, or even where maps don't exist, to give us some insights into how a landscape came to be, how it was shaped over time. We might, of course, use maps to help us to visualize that landscape in order to be able to understand it and look at its shape, look at its features, look at its, what the word we would use is morphology, that is to say the shape of the features in the landscape, in order to help us to understand it, to read it." And this is what Hoskins was arguing in The Making of the English Landscape. The landscape is the richest historical record we possess, but we can use maps to represent landscapes, and we can study maps for the information that they contain about landscapes. And on that basis, we can begin to perhaps read how a landscape has changed over time. So in the quotation there, he's referring specifically to towns, boroughs as he calls them, but towns in a constitutional sense. And making the point, this is back in 1955, of course, that there are many books on boroughs, he says, looking at their institutional aspects, their political history, their administrations, which were very popular in the 1920s and 1930s. But one looks in vain, he says, for any discussion of their physical growth, where their original core lay, of the directions in which they grew, and when and why, and of what accounts for their street plan and their shape today. So it's that word shape, their layout, their form, because it's that layout, that form, of the landscape that tells us so much about how that place came to be shaped the way that it was, the processes that shaped it over time. So Hoskins is drawing our attention to this. It wasn't really Hoskins that pursued that particular vein of research back in the 1950s. It was left to someone else, this chap, with Maurice Beresford, an economic historian at the University of Leeds, who wrote this amazing book. If any of you knows it, is about 3 inches thick, published in 1967, New Towns of the Middle Ages, Town Plantation in England, Wales and Gascony. And what Hoskins was doing, what Beresford was doing in this book was taking on board what Hoskins was arguing, that the landscape itself is a way to explore the origins and development of, in this case, urban landscapes. So what Beresford begins to do is to map out urban landscapes. The example there is Heddon in Yorkshire, just north of Hull. He maps it out, looking at the layout of fields, the layout of the streets. The black features are the kind of harbours or havens, because at that point in time, Heddon was very much a port town. This sort of landlocked now. But he was using the map as a way to give us some insight into the landscape and its configuration, how the landscape looked, and arguing that the landscape is evidence for how this particular town came to be, how it was planned, how it was formed as a new town of the Middle Ages. So that's why I've written up there that he's interested in urban layouts as proxies for medieval planning practices, about understanding how medieval towns were shaped on the ground. And he uses this phrase, which I prefer the phrase silent witness rather than as he describes it here. But he says, documentary references to the actual operation of laying out and assigning building plots of a new town are few. Correct. There are very few documentary sources of the period from the 12th and 13th centuries when these towns were created that actually tell us much about the processes that shape them on the ground. It's an important point we're going to come back to. But he says in compensation, there is a dumb witness of the sites. And by that, what he really means is what Hoskins was talking about, that the landscape is a record of its own evolution. That the landscape, the traces in it, the forms of the streets, the disposition of churches, where the marketplace was, all of these things are clues about the planning and the development of a particular urban landscape. On the cover of his book is one of these new towns in the Middle Ages. It's Winchelsea in Sussex. And this idea that Beresford puts forward, actually by 1967 was already a couple of decades old. I know quite a lot to a chap called Humman, whose map of Winchelsea is on the right-hand side there, and was very much an influence on Beresford in new towns in the Middle Ages. So Beresford was trying to, as an economic historian, account for the rise and fall of these new towns, which you can see from that graph there. He's graphed them out based upon the documentary sources, which are by and large charters. These are legal records for the founding of or chartering of particular towns. He looked at Wales and Gascony and England as well. And you can begin to see the rise and fall, how the chartering of towns, of new towns especially, begins to rise through the 12th and into the 13th centuries. And then it really tails off into the 14th century. So there's sort of peaks and troughs. And he's interested in that process of the chartering of these new towns. But he was also interested in the layout of these new towns. And for that, he turned to the work of people like Humman here, who'd been working in the middle part of the 20th century. Now, Winchelsea is a really, really interesting case in point. And the reason for that is it actually has quite detailed documentation relating to it. Because Winchelsea, for those who know it, Winchelsea is sometimes described as New Winchelsea. And it's called New Winchelsea because there was an old Winchelsea. And I'm afraid old Winchelsea is no more, because old Winchelsea in the late 13th century was being inundated by the sea. This sounds like a familiar story to us, doesn't it, these days? So the old town of Old Winchelsea was being washed away. by the sea. And the king, Edward I at the time, was concerned about this because Winchelsea was a very important port town. It was also very important militarily, strategically, as well as a gateway from France into England for the wine trade. So it was necessary to refound or re-establish Winchelsea on a higher and drier site. So as an example of a new town of the Middle Ages, it really draws our attention, attracts our eye. And so this is what Beresford was interested in new towns of the Middle Ages as an example. It's why it appears on the front cover of his book, because the documentation for Winchelsea is somewhat special. Not surprisingly, since the Crown was involved, it's very well documented. There was a rental, that is a record of the properties, the plots, and their value and their size, and also to whom they were being conferred. And these were people who had lived in Old Winchelsea were being transferred to New Winchelsea up on the hill. And the way the rental was organised, the documentary source there on the right-hand side, reflected the new layout of New Winchelsea. The first street, the second street, it looks very much like New York City, doesn't it, really? Third Street, Fourth Street, and so on and so forth. And the other numbers there reflect what are called the blocks or quarters, as Beresford referred to them in New Towns and Middle Ages, of different quarters. So it's very much an organised layout of Winchelsea, and that organisation was reflected in the documentation, which you see on the right-hand side there. And it was that rental from 1292 that enabled Hummon to create this map. So this is not a medieval map of New Winchelsea. It is a modern map, a map that Hummon himself has produced. But the survey, the rental itself, is a kind of medieval map. It's a textual map rather than a visual map. But it organises the layout of the new town through those lists of quarters, street by street. And it was on that basis that Hummon was able to reconstruct, as it says here, a plan of Winchelsea as originally laid out, reconstructed from the rent roll of 1292, which is the thing on the right-hand side there. So he was able to create this scaled plan of Winchelsea using the documentary sources, using field work, but also using, importantly here, an Ordnance Survey plan, large-scale Ordnance Survey plan, the 25-inch sheet. And what Hummon said is it should be therefore possible from the rent roll to reconstruct the original layout of the town, as you see here on the left-hand side. And the first step to do this is naturally to ascertain the land measure used, which is the virga, a measure of 16 feet and 3 inches, which you can see in its scale there. So fortunately, because Winchelsea is arranged in these nice, neat street blocks, and the properties themselves are listed with their sizes, and they're also listed in a way that is consistent and systematic around the town, it was possible for Hummon to actually use the rental and the Ordnance Survey map and his fieldwork to reconstruct this otherwise otherwise unmapped place from the medieval period. This is Winchelsea today. It's a shrunken town, although Old Winchelsea was washed away by the sea, somewhat paradoxically, the harbour at Winchelsea, New Winchelsea, silted up, and it no longer was sustainable as a port town. And during the course of the late Middle Ages, it gradually shrank in its population. So the aerial photograph there, just to confuse you even more, is orientated with north to the top, whereas the map, as you can see from the compass point, is orientated with the east to the top. It's just the way Winchelsea is drawn by Hummon there. So what makes Winchelsea really interesting from looking at Newtown's point of view is that it is very well documented, and usually so because it was refounded under the authority of Edward I. And he appointed these three chaps, Stephen de Pencester, Henry de Wallace, and Gregory de Rokesley, to, as it says there, plan and assess the new town of Ireham, as it was called then, which the king was ordering to be built, to plan and give directions for the streets and lanes necessary for the new town, for places for the market, for two churches, and then to assign and deliver to the barons, as they're called, but that's to say the burgesses, those places according to the requirements of their state, because they were coming from Old Winchelsea, and to provide and give directions concerning harbours and all things necessary, and so on and so forth. This is unusual because it is a very specific and explicit account of laying out of a new town in the medieval period, in the Middle Ages. This is from the 1280s, 1283, as you can see there. So this is why this captures the imagination as an example. And what this goes back to what Homer was doing with this material. He was, as it says there in the quotation at the top from his work, as far as it has been possible to compare the areas on the hill, that's to say where Winchester is being created in the survey of 1291-92, with the same areas as given on the Ordnance Survey map, that's the 25-inch sheet, there appears to be a difference of only about 1%. So what he was arguing here is that there was a very high degree of accuracy in the laying out and the survey work or the enumeration of those plots in the rental that he was using to reconstruct the layout of Winchelsea. So the use of the Ordnance Survey map here in relation to the documentary sources suggests there is a degree of continuity between the 13th century of the rental from 1291-92 to the Ordnance Survey of the middle to later part of the 19th century, continuity in the landscape and the configuration of the urban landscape itself. So there's the Ordnance Survey, there's the 25-inch on the right-hand side, again oriented obviously with north to the top, so you have to sort of turn your head to one side if you want to compare it to the map that Hammond produced on the left-hand side. So what Winchelsea, as I've mentioned, was founded by Edward I, and I'm not giving you a talk here on the history of towns. That's not the point. The point is really to think a little bit about the ways in which Ordnance Survey, large-scale maps and plans can begin to be used to give us some insights into the process, otherwise fairly poorly documented process, which was unusual, of the planning and design of medieval towns across these islands. The virga, by the way, and this is something I've been working on recently, is an interesting unit of measure because it is a measure in terms of as a rule, it is a measure on the ground, but the virga was also used to signify the rod, which you can see Edward I is depicted there with. So a rod was also a kind of symbol of the king's rule. So the virga itself meant rule in both senses, rule along the ground as a unit of measure, but also rule as a way of deploying political power or sovereignty. So the word virga then, which means rod, is quite a significant one in the laying out of Winchelsea. So it reinforces the authority of the king at that particular time. So I'm going to say a little bit about new towns and their forms. And I want to try and dispel a myth, which is a very persistent myth. It's been around a long time, back to the 1930s. Patrick Abercrombie, some of you may know Patrick Abercrombie for his work as a planner in the interwar period and during the war and immediately after the Second World War, replanning places like Plymouth, Hull, London, and so on and so forth. Abercrombie was a town planner. But as well as that, he wrote a little book in 1933 called Town and Country Planning. And he used examples from Europe, as you can see there, of what he considered to be two different types of medieval town. What he called the medieval garden city on the top there, which is actually Vern, which is on the Belgian-French border, which has a very sort of irregular looking pattern to it. And he was contrasting that as a type of town to what he calls at the bottom there, a squared bastide, a town with regularity. And this distinction between the irregular layout of the garden city and the more regular layout like the bastide has been something which has really dogged the history of medieval towns and cities, I would argue. And we can see it a little bit actually in this quotation at the top there from David Nicholas in a textbook called Urban Europe, where he makes the link between that more irregular form on the left-hand side at the top with what he described as organic growth type towns. And he contrasts that with the more regular type layout on the bottom there, which he considers to be more indicative of planning. The Bastides and new towns, he says, had more regular street plans than did cities that evolved organically. And this is a myth. It's something that's been perpetuated in the histories of urban planning for decades, if not centuries, if not millennia, because it actually owes its origins, if you look beneath that quote from David Nicholas, back to even Aristotle. writing in the politics, in writing on the siting and defense of the city. So this is from Aristotle. As for the layout of private dwelling houses, the modern or Hippodamian scheme of regularity is more attractive and more useful for all activities except ensuring safety in war, for which the old-fashioned, i.e. irregular layout, was better, being hard for foreign forces to get into and to penetrate in their attacks. So right back to ancient or classical times, we have distinction being drawn between, based upon the layout of towns, the regular type, in this case being seen as more attractive, but the regular type for Nicholas being seen as an evidence of planning, as opposed to the irregular or organic type town, which appears to have grown higgledy-piggledy. Well, nonsense, says this man, M.R.G. Conzen, writing in the 1960s. Nonsense. He says, careful study of individual cases and of groups of medieval towns in various parts of Europe. He was himself a German emigre who fled Nazi Germany in the end of the 1930s to Britain. He said, careful study of individual cases and of groups of medieval towns in various parts of Europe has rather discredited the opposition of irregular versus regular plans. He's writing here in 1968. And the unhistorical equation of these, he says, with spontaneously grown or unplanned and planned towns. In other words, he is diametrically opposed to the position that Aristotle and Nicholas are proposing, and also Abercrombie here. So Conzen is really important to us in understanding the layouts and the significance of the layouts, the forms that these medieval layouts of towns and cities have, and how we can begin to interpret them in terms of their histories and their development. It's quite wrong to make that artificial distinction, Conzen says, between the organic, irregular type town on the one hand and the planned and regular type town on the other hand. Quite wrong to do that. It's much more complicated, he says. So what does he say? So let me say a little bit more about Conzen, because it's an approach which gives us some real clues to go back to what Hoskins was writing about as to how the landscape is the richest historical record we possess. So Conzen produces a methodology, a set of techniques called town plan analysis. And it's this town plan analysis approach which gives us some detailed insights into the significance of the different forms that our urban landscapes take. This is the man himself, died in 2000. M.R.G. Conzen wrote a very important for geography influential study published by the Institute of British Geographers in 1960 on Alnwick, as it says there, Alnwick, Northumberland, a study in town plan analysis. This was a monograph, a very detailed, quite technical piece of work actually, which was very much map-based, as you'll see in a minute. And what Conzen was arguing, as you can see from that little quotation there, is that we need to use, he says here, the 1 to 2500 scale ordnance map to study our historic towns. And from these, he says, a pattern of streets, of plot boundaries and buildings of bewildering complexity begin to emerge. And it was Conzen's task really to try and make sense of this bewildering complexity that he saw when he looked, like we did at the very start of my talk, when we looked at the map of Coventry, the plan of Coventry, the 25-inch plan. When we look at something like that, it does appear to be initially quite complex. There's a lot of information on it relating to the urban landscape, its street pattern, the pattern of plots, the disposition of buildings, and so on and so forth. So Conzen was trying to impose some order on this apparent chaos, but used the map as a way of telling a story about how a town came to be. And he chose Alnwick because he was based at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, and Alnwick was just up the road. So it's very easy for him to get to Alnwick. So on the right-hand side there, from his study of Alnwick, what Conzen has done is he's used the map, the large scale, the 25-inch scale, first edition OS, which is on the left-hand side there, as you can see. He's used that as a basis to extract certain information, which he then makes a rather, a leap of faith, shall we say, but nevertheless probably a reasonably secure leap of faith between the layout he sees in the patterns of the buildings, of bewildering complexity, the plot boundaries, the streets and so on the OS map, as a basis for drawing out, quite literally, drawing out from that the disposition, the configuration of medieval features, which he was interested in mapping out here. So there is no map of medieval Alnwick. So he says, right, well, let's try and make a map of medieval Alnwick. What does it look like to scale? You know, and to do that, he uses the OS and he analyzes the layout of the streets and the plots and the buildings on the OS 25-inch sheet. And he comes up there with his plan of medieval Alnwick. So with the marketplace, those of you know Alnwick with its fantastic bookshop, the castle here of now Harry Potter fame, the River Orne up here, and the layout of, if you know Alnwick, you know the big triangular marketplace, which still exists, and the very narrow plots extending back from the streets, which you can see here on this reconstruction. And you've only got to eyeball across to the 25-inch map to see the origins, the source that he was using here, principally to map out medieval Alnwick. So this is something that Conzen was advocating, and 1960, as I said, was the start of this sort of journey for Conzen, and it's been very much influential, and it was the basis for my own PhD work as a particular approach. So in the 1960s, we have another publication by Conzen, but this time on Ludlow. So you have to turn your head to one side again on this side, I'm afraid. This comes from a book edited by Dias, The Study of Urban History, a book ostensibly written by historians for historians, but Conzen was one of the contributors and wrote this little chapter, the use of town plans in the study of urban history. And he makes the point again, as you can see from that quotation at the top, about the 25-inch plan and also the 1 to 12, 51, 500s are all of great use because of their accuracy and detail, he says, for studying urban landscapes. Moreover, there are early now obsolete ordnance survey large-scale plans of certain towns, which are equally good. I'm assuming he's referring there perhaps to the Board of Health plans, and are of the greatest importance to the urban historian in Britain, as they generally take us back to the middle of the 19th century, of course, when the time of the maps themselves being produced, to the beginning of what he calls the climax phase of the Industrial Revolution. But the point he makes about Ludlow is, but the point we've just been looking at with Alnwick, these plans take us back to the medieval urban landscape. And he says Ludlow is a good example of this. So he's using the layout of Ludlow as represented on the 25-inch plan there you see from 1926 on the right-hand side. He's reduced that down to 1 to 5,000. I think 1 to 5,000 he saw as a very good working scale, because it was small enough to be to help the layout of the town and its different sort of patterns begin to appear to the eye. But it was sufficiently detailed, unlike, I say, a 1 to 10,000 map, which does not usually show plot boundaries, but the 1 to 5,000 or 1 to 2,500, sufficiently large scale to show individual buildings and plot patterns, all of which were important to him in his plan analysis work, which you'll see in just a moment. But he recognizes a methodological weakness, as it says there in the bottom of that quotation. And that methodological weakness is one that's often been pointed out to me and to others who use this sort of approach. How can you use a 19th century ordnance survey map to conjecture, to reconstruct the layout of a town for 800 years before? How is that even conceivable? How can you be really sure that the plots and the streets that you're looking at on that plan of Ludlow, albeit on the side, actually do really belong to the 12th or the 13th centuries? So that is a methodological challenge. It is a challenge for us, and it's a right to ask that question. So let's look at that question and excavate the map. Let's look beneath and behind the lines on the map and begin to think about those plots, those streets that the OS large-scale plans from the 19th century, what they actually do reveal of the medieval urban landscape that lies literally beneath. So we can do that in a number of ways, actually. And one of the ways we can do that is similarly to what Homan was doing for Winchelsea, Salter did for Oxford. So he used very detailed property records for Oxford from different periods, but 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, that sort of period. And he managed to reconstruct from those records, from those property histories, those charters and so forth, and deeds, property deeds, he managed to reconstruct a map although again, we don't have a medieval map of Oxford from 1375. So it's a modern rendering of a medieval map of Oxford here that we have. He's trying to reconstruct Oxford as it looked in 1375 using documentary sources. And he uses as a base the Ordnance Survey, again, like Homan, the 25-inch OS. So when he, and this is another little publication of Salter's, a cartography is basically a book or a list of records relating to property, in this case for Oxford, the Hospital of St. John the Baptist. And as you can see from the red box there I put round, this is plan number 7, he says, in his mapping out of these property records for the Hospital of St. John the Baptist. Plan number 7 is based upon the Ordnance Survey. So he's using here the OS 25-inch. I imagine it's a 25-inch. It could potentially be the large scale map, but we imagine it's a 25-inch because the 25-inch does show plots in detail. And he's using that as a basis alongside his property records from the, in this case, the cartography, to reconstruct the sequence, as you can see that on this map here, the north side of High Street, the sequence of properties, the names of the properties themselves, as you run along the north side of High Street here, the site of Queen's College and so on. But the plots themselves, the layout of these plots here, is very much relying on the Ordnance Survey map 4. But the sequence that he can reconstruct from the documentary sources fits with the pattern that he sees on the Ordnance Survey plan, which again suggests a kind of degree of continuity between the medieval period from the documentary sources, from let's say the 13th to 14th centuries, running right the way through into the 19th century for the OS. Similarly, around the same sort of time in Hull, we have the work of Bilson, who did something very similar for Hull, using a rental and property deeds from the 1290s. Actually, Hull, like Winchelsea, was also refounded by Edward I. So another nice link for us there. And Hull, with its documentary sources, and particularly a rental from 1347, was used as a basis for reconstructing the layout of the medieval plots of Hull circa 1350, as you can see there. But the basis of this, as well as the documentary sources, is again the Ordnance Survey large-scale plans, the 25-inch scale. And in this particular case, archaeological study in these same places has actually confirmed the longevity of those plot patterns, in some cases shown by the Ordnance Survey 25-inch maps. So this is a little quotation from John Schofield and Alan Vince's book, Medieval Towns, talking about a series of excavations on High Street there, Blackfriar Gate in Hull in the 1970s. By this phase, they're talking about before 1352, the tenement boundaries, that's to say the plot boundaries, they say, had been fixed. So fixed in location terms, partly by stone walls. And these survived to the 20th century, in other words, to the time of the Ordnance Survey. So it seems to confirm that the little plan up here shows you a boundary wall, and the top right-hand corner up here. This is the excavated plan of one of these houses, the west wing here, the hall wing, the street is at the front here, is Blackfriar Gate. This is the garden area, or the area behind the building, the built frontage, and the boundary wall. So what we can begin to do from a combination of archaeology and documentary sources is begin to give a little bit sort of certainty to our supposition that these plot boundaries and street patterns on the OS 25-inch are themselves generally medieval. Another similar approach is the one that Terry Slater uses for Stratford-upon-Avon. So Terry Slater was actually my PhD supervisor at the University of Birmingham, was very much in that kind of Consen mode, the Consenian school, as it's sometimes called, and did a study, a very detailed study of Stratford-upon-Avon. You can see his map, Slater's map on the right-hand side, using Board of Health plans. This is from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust archive for Stratford, where the Board of Health plans have been captured digitally. And the map on the left-hand side shows part of the area of Bridge Street, which is this area where it says M on the little map up here. There's Bridge Street here. And there's the street here, which is High Street coming off. And what Terry Slater was interested in was trying to reconstruct the layout of Stratford-upon-Avon using a combination of the historic maps, in this case, the Board of Health, alongside field work in Stratford-upon-Avon itself, and measuring the widths of plots, which he could do by locating those plots from the Ordnance Survey. So the plot pattern is visible on the OS. They're also visible in the urban landscape because, of course, Stratford-upon-Avon is a reasonably well conserved urban landscape, historic urban landscape, despite its fires in the past. And what Slater was trying to do was to use a process called metrological analysis, which sounds a bit complicated, but basically what it involves is measuring the frontages of plots and buildings. And he was able to do this and relate it back to the founding charter for Stratford, which was from the 1190s, 1196, which somewhat unusually, mentioned in it, this is from the bishops of Worcester, mentioned in it the sizes of the plots themselves. They were to be 3.5 perches wide. We now, a perch is 16.5 statute feet. So the statute perch of 3.5 perches was being used in Stratford to lay out the plots. We know that from the documentary sources. So what Terry Slater did is he went out into the field and he used the plot patterns on the maps and in the field to see if we could identify that width of 3.5 perches. And lo and behold, he could. And the diagram on the left-hand side indicates what Terry Slater managed to reconstruct from the more recent times. The plots have been on this corner of High Street and Bridge Street, which we saw just a moment ago here. We're talking about these plots just here, that they became subdivided. So originally the plots all fronted onto Bridge Street, running north-south, but over time they became subdivided and began to front onto High Street. But the original pattern of these 3.5 perch width plots was nevertheless fossilized in the urban landscape and fossilized by the Ordnance Survey, a Board of Health plan here from 1851. So again, emphasizing this continuity in the urban landscape using metrological analysis. And to really hammer home the point, if we need even greater confirmation that there is this continuity in the urban landscape for sometimes for very long time periods, we can turn to the work of the archaeologists in places such as York. I really love the cover image of the Coppergate excavations. I'm sure many of you have been to Jorvik in York, but we have here a little extract of the archaeological plan of the site superimposed upon the modern day aerial photograph. And I really like the way in which the historic features, excavated features, are related to the modern urban landscape. But on the left-hand side, the very valuable diagram for us here has on the left-hand axis here the dates going from 1000. We know, of course, York is has Viking origin, so back to around 1000 AD, running all the way through to the time of the 19th century and, of course, the Ordnance Survey. So what we have here in this schematic representation is a series of properties with boundaries between them, and these lines represent those boundaries over time. And what this graph indicates is continuity from 1000 AD, more or less going right the way through with 1 or 2 breaks. This has been archaeologically proven, folks, right the way through to the time of the OS. Some breaks, but nevertheless a continuity in the sequence right the way through the medieval period into the early modern period and into the industrial period as well. So for me, these examples of documentary sources, like the ones I showed you for Hull, like the ones we saw for Winchelsea and so on, and like the ones we saw for Oxford, together with the metrological analysis of Terry Slater's in Stratford-upon-Avon, like the archaeological research being done here in York and other places as well, all aligns, all confirms the longevity of the layouts of those plots that we see on the Ordnance Survey 25-inch scale plans and the Board of Health, the larger scale 1 to 500 to 1528. What can we do with this? Well, let me tell you. I'm going to say a little bit now, and then I'm going to end, actually, because I see I've already been talking for nearly 55 minutes, if you're still with me. I'm going to say a little bit how we can begin to use these different kinds, this particular kind of approach to tell a story about 2 particular cities as they are now, medieval Swansea and medieval Coventry. Both have very similar kinds of challenges to us because unlike York, unlike Oxford, unlike Stratford-upon-Avon, the urban landscapes of Swansea and Coventry were badly destroyed in the Second World War. That's the aerial image on the right-hand side there. And a project I had called City Witness, along with colleagues, including Catherine Clark, now at the University of London, was to try and map out the layout, to reconstruct the layout of Swansea. Not using necessarily documentary sources, but using as a basis the OS 25-inch and also the Ordnance Survey 1500s for Swansea and also the Board of Health 1528s for Swansea, all of which we have available to us, and to undertake that process of analysis that Conzen talks about, plan analysis, and using the plots on the Ordnance Survey maps as a proxy for the plots that were existed in the medieval period, and from that deduce something of the morphology or the shape of medieval Swansea as it was in around 1300. And we did that through using a geographic information system. This rather messy image here shows you the different, the Ordnance Survey Historic OS, in this case the Water 500, as a base map, superimposed upon it, the different colours representing archaeological features in black. And in the kind of magenta colour and purpley colour are the buildings as they are today, because Swansea was so significantly reconstructed after the Second World War. And what this again enables us to confirm is that the configuration of streets, by and large shown by the Ordnance Survey 1 to 500 from the 1870s, 1880s, do indeed reflect medieval features, ditches for the castle, for example. So that kind of continuity is still present in the case of Swansea. Up until the 19th century, of course, it's different now, post-20th century, post-Blitz. So within the GIS, we were able to layer up our different sources to reconstruct the layout of medieval Swansea. And the same process for Coventry. So this is from what's now called the Peart collection after Jamie Peart at the University of Birmingham. And Jamie very, very kindly, many years ago, when I was interested in looking at post-war Coventry, dug out these 1 to 2500s for Coventry for a really significant time period for the city, 1946 to 1949. And it really captures that moment where that medieval urban landscape, which in effect is what the OS first edition 25-inch sheet we started out with shows, that transition into the modern rebuilt urban landscape with Donald Gibson. So we see the new Broadgate is shown here on this map here. And also some of the other roads are the sort of newer roads coming in. But equally, there's Smithford Street as it was originally before the Blitz, still being shown as it was. So it's an interesting map for me because it captures this transition. But Coventry, like Swansea, of course, as we know, is badly bombed, as you see the aerial photograph there. So how do we go about using this as a proxy or surrogate for mapping out medieval Coventry? This is what I did my PhD thesis on many moons ago. And again, it's the same process of extracting those features that Conzen talked about. When we look at a map like this, think about that bewildering complexity. Do you remember the words he used? Bewildering complexity of the streets, the plots, and the buildings. Now, how do we make sense of that? Well, we simplify this very complex map into the constituent, what Conzen calls elements, plan elements of streets and plots and buildings. So this is, if you like, looking at the skeleton of Coventry, the bones which made up Coventry and which survived right the way through to the 19th century. And the plot patterns there, you can begin to see the roads running through Coventry. The thick black line is the city walls, which actually in the case of Coventry came in quite late in the 14th and 15th centuries. They weren't there in the 12th and 13th centuries. But Coventry was pretty much at its maximum extent, that's about a mile from end to end, at its maximum extent by about 1300. So Coventry had developed over a long time period from about 1000 and about 1050 through to about 1300. And the layout of the town itself fossilizes that process of development. And we can begin to confirm the longevity of these features which we're mapping out from the OS by archaeological excavations. So here's, for example, plotting out for my PhD thesis, an excavation on a ditch, which is aligned perfectly with the plot boundary running through here. We can see that from the Coventry Atlas is an excellent digital resource if you're interested. And I've snaffled here one of the examples from the map layers for the 1851 Board of Health. And the feature we were just looking at was this feature here. Do you see the plot boundary running through? Just go back a moment. It's this one here. You see the very narrow plots, so like 3 plots above it. So it's these ones here I'm talking about. And we can begin to see, again, perhaps with an eye of faith, but we begin to see a connection running through here of alignments in the urban landscape, running right the way through, if you can follow my arrow here, which is basically the alignment of the ditch picked out here and partially excavated. So again, it points to this longevity in the features, and that included the castle for Coventry, a somewhat enigmatic feature. Coventry is not renowned for its castle. It was demolished after the Civil War, Stephen's reign in the 1150s. So by 1200, it pretty much disappeared, but it was certainly there in the 12th century under the Earls of Chester. So we were able to reconstruct the layout of the castle, and it was that which informed the Historic Towns Trust. Jerry mentioned my involvement with the Historic Towns Trust. I still am involved, really, but the map of Coventry, the siting of the castle, which we mapped out for the UK City of Culture year for Coventry. If you're interested, we also now have maps of Swansea available in the same series, or using the same methodology. But again, the examples I've just been showing you from Swansea, looking at medieval Swansea, looking at medieval Coventry, has all helped to inform what appears on those maps, I'm pleased to say. So this is when we first look at this image, it is bewildering in its complexity, but if we begin to simplify it, it begins to tell a story of the landscape and its development. And that is also reflected in if we look in detail at the differences across the urban landscape, we see, in fact, this is not uniform. There are different areas with different appearances or forms. Some of the forms are quite regular. Some of the forms are quite irregular. That's not to say one is planned and one is not planned. We're not going to fall into that trap. We're not going to fall into that trap laid by Aristotle or David Nicholas. We're going to remember what M.R.G. Conzen said, that we mustn't make that artificial distinction between the planned and the unplanned. Coventry in the Middle Ages was growing through a process of carefully controlled and planned development. The Earls of Chester were looking to make money out of the property they owned in Coventry. So they weren't just going to let anybody just rock up and start laying out properties on their land. No, instead, they laid out certain areas, these discrete areas. Conzen calls them plan units, but these are the phases of growth. As you can imagine, Coventry growing outwards from the area where the castle was situated here, growing outwards to the east, growing outwards to the west, these very long suburbs, and ultimately also growing out to the south on the road to London. And we can see that pattern of development, of these planned phases of development imprinted on the urban landscape. And that's what Conzen is reminding us to think about. When he talks about Alnwick here, he's using colours, but it's exactly the same principle of looking at the differences in shape and form of streets and plots, just as with Coventry here, and mapping out, in this case, medieval Coventry's development, which is undocumented. So we're using, again, the urban landscape as a proxy. We're using our Ordnance Survey maps as a window onto the past to reconstruct the layout of Coventry and its sequence of development. I'm going to end about now, folks, you'll be pleased to hear, but I'm going to end with thinking a little bit about where do we might go with all of this stuff and where next. And one of the things that Conzen's particularly keen to get us to think about is using this approach to compare places. So, for example, these are two what were obviously considered to be by many historians new towns. Conwy in North Wales, founded by Edward I, and Ludlow in Shropshire is often considered to be a new town. But what Conzen showed us is that these new towns of the Middle Ages were in fact themselves developed over a time period, over a sequence of different phases of development. So they have these composite layouts, these layouts which are based on different forms, both regular and irregular, or both of these equally planned with different chronologies. So this is my own plan of Ludlow here, using the same approach as Conzen. This is the OS 25 inch, 1 to 2500, as you can see on the left-hand side, and my plots and my streets and my plan units. Thinking about how, just as we've seen with Coventry, we can begin to compare this new town, this town of Ludlow, with other towns like it in Shropshire or elsewhere, for example. And a project I had a few years ago, we did this for the new towns of Edward I, including Conwy. So this is our map of Conwy here. This was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, my colleague Chris Lloyd and Steve Trick at Queen's. We mapped out Conwy as it was in the time of its foundation. That's what it looks like today, of course. Well, that's what it looked like in 2005 when we did the work. And then Beaumaris here, another town founded slightly later than Conwy. Conwy is the 1280s, Beaumaris is the 1290s. Both castle towns, both founded by Edward I. And what we found is, looking at the layouts of these towns, when we picked off the layout of the streets, that picked out here in purple, of Conwy, and we dropped in the GIS that same pattern from Conwy onto the pattern for Beaumaris, a perfect match, which was almost unbelievable. The geometry of the streets for Conwy are an exact match for Beaumaris, but weirdly, only if you flip Beaumaris as a mirror image, which suggests some sort of jiggery pokery on our part. But I don't think so. I think this is actually reflecting the processes of the planning of the towns at the time and the work of Master James of St. George, who was the master architect for the castles of Edward I in North Wales in the 1280s, 1290s. So I think we have here an architect working as a town planner, designing the layout of the town and using that plan in a very deliberate way. And as part of that project, we were interested in comparing these towns of Edward I to look at similarities and differences in their forms, and to use the approach that Conson taught us and the Ordnance Survey plans that lie beneath all of these visualizations of medieval new towns to begin to think about similarities and differences. So, for example, Rutland here, founded in 1277, has a layout which is not a million miles away from Flint, also founded in 1277, but different from Aberystwyth, also founded in 1277. Here's Winchelsea on the right-hand side. So why is it that a group of towns founded in the same year by the same overlord, Edward I, have different, in some cases, different configurations, but in other cases, similar configurations, similar forms? And what does that tell us about their planning and design? So we can begin to experiment with these mappings of medieval new towns based upon the OS large-scale plans. So my challenge for us then, mapping futures, what we're going to do, what your homework is, if you like, is where I'm going to end. First of all, just a few sort of recap, really, what I've been talking about this evening. The first point relates back to that point by Paul Harvey, relatively few medieval maps of medieval towns, but they do exist, and in some cases they do survive. And where they do survive, they relate mainly to elites, organizations like city councils or monasteries or royal households and so on. And they often relate to planning and engineering. The morphological patterns, when we look at our large-scale OS maps, I'm talking here obviously about the 1 to 2500s we've been looking at, 1 to 500s, 1 5 to 8, that sort of scale. The morphological patterns, the streets and the plots and buildings we see on those larger scale plans and maps, we can begin to use as proxies for their medieval antecedents. The fossilized layouts of medieval urban landscapes are preserved by the OS maps and plans. And from that, we can deduce a sequence of developments, which is otherwise often undocumented in contemporary sources, which tells us something about the development of these towns. We can use our geographic information systems to help us do that by layering up our different sources and visualizing in different dimensions. We can begin to compare, because these maps and plans can be produced to modern standards, to scale, in other words, unlike the medieval maps. We can begin to make direct comparisons of one place with another place. We try and explain what makes them different or similar. And then we can begin to perhaps even develop that much more widely, not just relating to Wales or to England or to Scotland, to Britain, but more widely across Europe. And all of this, I think, begins on the right-hand side there. You can see a medieval illuminated manuscript, God as architect of the universe, helps us to begin to think about those processes, often undocumented processes, that shaped urban landscapes 800 or 1,000 years ago. So the homework is to use National Library of Scotland's fantastic web mapping application to look at the 25-inch OS in particular, which you can see there, the coverage, which is pretty good actually, certainly for most urban parts of Great Britain, there is good coverage. And to actually zoom in, as I have here in one I prepared earlier in a very much Blue Peter style, for Newport Pagnell, that great metropolis. I hope nobody's here from Newport Pagnell, but if you are, you might recognize this. And the reason I mention this is because the Newport Pagnell itself is, you know, a common or garden medieval town in many ways, small place, probably relatively poorly documented. But the layout that we see on the Ordnance Survey 25-inch plan here, or map, shows some interesting features. I mean, for a start, here's the church, which is aligned with the street. See the way the street is aligned with the church. There's a castle over here behind the church. They have a road coming in which dog legs around. But look at this. What explains this curving line? You see the curve of the street here? It's called on the map Union Street, curving around. And that same curvature is picked up by the line of this plot boundary here and these plots down here. It seems to indicate some sort of enclosure, does it not? It actually links into this other curved street up here just behind the church. So, you know, we begin to see patterns emerge and we start looking at the streets, that bewildering complexity. We begin to see patterns. What do they mean? Well, that's our homework. We can use documentary sources. We know Newport Pagnell was a Domesday borough. It was there at the time of Domesday book. That's what that is there, Domesday 1086. And it has origins before that, really. But nevertheless, we know it was there in the late 11th century. So a combination of documentary sources and map-based sources, and we can begin to tell some interesting, I think, interesting and important stories about the origin and development of our medieval urban landscapes. So that's the end, folks. Thank you very much for listening. If you're still with me, I just want to acknowledge the funders, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, British Academy and Lilley Hume Trust have all been fantastic in enabling me to do this research over the last 30 years. And also my own current institution at Queen's University Belfast have also been hugely supportive. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to stop sharing at that if you're still here.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Keith. That was a tour de force, very appropriately captioned. I think what is past is prologue.
Yes.
I'm not sure if it's forwards or reverse, but thank you for that amount of work that you've put into that presentation. Thank you very much. And I can see some applause.
Thank you.
Reaction symbols being shown there. It really is terrific. It's lovely as well to see some of these towns which on various Charles Close Society visits we've seen and enjoyed, like Alnwick in particular for me, but of course other places like York, where we've been, and Oxford, we've been together, and not least Conway, which I stayed in while climbing for quite a bit, and bought some interesting maps up a back street as well. But anyway, that's something else again. If I may I say to everyone who's enjoyed that, and I'm sure that's everybody, all 40 of us, that on the 8th of October, if you're interested in seeing more of the Welsh, certainly borderlands, I don't know about the towns so much, but Scott Lloyd is giving us a talk on the 8th of October on the Marcher lordships, and some of those Welsh towns will feature again. Scott Lloyd is research manager. I'm going to say this in Welsh because it's easier in English. The Commission Brenhinol Enepion Cymru, which in English extends to the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales. How about that for a snappy title? But that's to look forward to then. But thank you very much indeed. I've learned what a verga is, but what possible use is it other than land measurement? A 16'3" is almost the same as 5 meters. 5 meters, but I can't think of any other measure that is involved in that. I know it's a silly point, but how is it made up? Who invented the verga?
Good question. I mean, some of these customary measures are very strange. And the fact the Verga in Winchelsea, as you say, is 16 feet 3 inches. Whereas,
Yes.
let me test you. What was the perch unit in Stratford upon Avon?
Well, isn't it usually 22 yards?
16 and a
No,
half feet. So
16.
for some reason in Winchelsea they're using 16 feet 3 inches, whereas in Stratford upon Avon in 1196 they're using 16 feet and 6 inches. You know, but then
I,
it's statute perch. I mean, the customary perch we might see in Winchelsea might explain that difference, the Verga. So they're
I'm
not
going to
units, Jerry. And at that time, that point in time, customary measures were still very
make.
much prevalent for measuring land parcels, but also, I'd argue, for laying out towns as well.
Yes, right. I'll just finish my ramblings by saying that how splendid those Swansea maps, and even the Abertawe one in Welsh, were fantastic. I'm the proud owner of those folks, and they're simply splendid. So rush out and buy those HTT maps. I know that there was a message there, I think it was from David Fairburn in chat, and I seem to have lost my chat control. Do you still have it? Would you like to read it and answer it?
Yes,
Oh,
well,
I've lost.
indeed. So it says here it's quite a long. um, it's about Burgage plots. I'm just trying to skim read it. Because research proposal template drafted by Dr. Burgage plot. So there must be something missing there because it doesn't quite make sense. Often equated to two rods or poles. Again, poles, perches, rods, vergas. You know, we're looking at similar sorts of measurements in terms of the actual length of these things. Constant didn't really consider, he says here, an even closer town to his location in Newcastle, which is Morpeth. You're right. I don't think Constant did look at Morpeth, but others have since, which is similar plot outlines to those in Alnwick. The question says, do you agree with the view that this was a pragmatic dimension related to how feasible it was to construct a house on the frontage using oak beams of an optimum length? Possibly, but I think what's really important here is how land in the medieval period, like land is today, it had value and would have been carefully measured, carefully calculated. And really, when we look at somewhere like Stratford upon Avon, that's what we see in the charter of the bishops in the 1196. They're stipulating 12 perches deep, 3.5 perches wide. That's what you get for your 12 pence a year. All right, nothing more, nothing less. Now, I think it's that control of land which is more important, I would suggest, and that constructing a house and your oak beams and so on would be done in a way which fits with the land that you've been assigned for your 12 pence a year rent as a burgess. I think that's the more significant thing. But the point being made there about similarities in plots is again an important one. And again, it was important to maybe look at somewhere like Alnwick in relation to local places like Morpeth, because you might expect similar processes being important in shaping both places because they are quite close in date and they're also quite close geographically. That's a good point, well made.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you, Keith. Anyone else got a question? Either raise your electronic hand or put it in chat if you want to type it, or just unmute. I have muted everyone during that talk to stop background noise, but if you would like to unmute, or I think you can press the space bar or Alt A if there's another way of doing it. If you've got a question, Rob has raised the hand. Rob Wheeler?
Yes, that was fascinating, Keith. As soon as I saw your plan of Coventry, I started wondering about Earl Street, because Earl Street has a bend in it. And in consequence, to the west of the bend, the Burgage plots are bent. And it seems to me that you have two options here. Either the generality of the width of the Burgage plot remains constant, which would fit with what you were saying about you get so much land. In which case, of course, the the frontage is now going to be increased by the bend, or the frontage remains constant, in which case you get thinner plots further back. And it seemed, I rather thought, looking at it, as though it was the frontage that was fixed, and it's as though the rear parts of the Burgage plot only started to become important later on. Is that the case?
It's a really good observation, actually, about those plots in Coventry on Earl Street. They are very distinctive. You're quite right. They're very narrow and they're very deep, is a word we use in morphological speak. Deep plots. They extend a long way back from the frontage. And they do more so on the south side of Earl Street than on the north side of Earl Street. So this, to me, when I was looking at this for my PhD, demanded explanation. You know, why would we might have expected along Earl Street, it's a single main street in Coventry, for plots on either side to be, you know, similar in terms of their depth. And the explanation is, I think, relating back to the castle, that the castle stood on the north side of Earl Street, so the plots sort of were curtailed by the castle. And the area of Earl Street itself, I'm drawing it with my hands here, those very deep plots seem to go back to that ditch that I mentioned. So what we appear to have is possibly, and this is very much, I mean, I know George Damidovic and others in Coventry are, you know, are not all in agreement with this, but it's possible. What we have is in Coventry, a small defended town, which may well be a burh, an Anglo-Saxon burh, defended town, with Earl Street running through the middle, so to speak, but slightly higher up. And then these plots on the south side are extending right the way back to that ditch. Why are they curved? Well, they're perhaps curved because they're trying to fit into the outlines of that ditch. But why is that ditch then curved? Why not build it straight? So these are the kinds of curiosities which demand explanation. Because we're looking at a period of around 1,000 years ago, of course, you know, it's kind of, a lot of this will nevertheless be somewhat speculative, but it's kind of making your best guess and thinking about how we can best align the evidence. So it's kind of circumstantial evidence often that we're having to use here. We don't have a lot of archaeology in Coventry related to this time period. We certainly don't have documentary sources related to this time period. All we have is the morphology. All we have is the OS plans to show us the morphology. And on that basis, you're quite right, Rob. You know, we need to think about the possibilities that, you know, the plots are made deep in order to facilitate a narrow frontage, because they're being laid out, being set out to accommodate a particular area, which is then being used to provide each person with rough equivalents for the fee that they're being paid for that privilege. It's a very good point, and again, it points to, I think, to the amount of information we can glean from studying Ordnance Survey maps, which is, you know, beyond the surface itself, but looking at the features that they represent. Thank you.
Can I come up with another one on Winchelsea?
Of course.
Where the plot blocks respect Greyfriars. Now, the friars normally establish themselves at the gate or at the edge of an existing town. And that makes me suppose from the map that the northern part of the town, north of Greyfriars, existed first. And then the friars appeared, and then the town started to extend around them. Is that backed up by any other evidence?
Well, Winchelsea, it does a fantastic volume published by English Heritage by David Martin on Winchelsea, which is, you know, an amazing study. So he would be able to get the chronology right now. So I'm slightly, but what you picked out is an important point with Winchelsea, because sometimes it's seen to be as a kind of whole. But when you start looking at what you've just described, looking at the details, Winchelsea appears to have been laid out in two phases. There's a phase which relates to the northern part of the town. The streets running north-south would appear to have been laid out at the same time. But the cross streets are on a different axis in the north than they are in the south. So it does appear to be, now the documentary sources seem to bear this out as well. There seems to be an extension southwards in the case of Winchelsea, which may well also then begin to explain the appearance of the friaries, which, as you say, do the mendicant orders tend to occupy more peripheral locations in medieval towns. They also tend to come quite late in medieval towns into the 13th and 14th centuries. So that kind of peripheral later location would indeed sort of work well with that idea that Winchelsea was laid out first to the north and then subsequently extended further to the south. So that's a good point.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Rob. Anyone else, please? Raise your electronic hand if you can find it under reactions. I think it is the thing at the bottom, because that puts your name or face right in front. Click on reactions and then click on raise hand if there are any more questions. Otherwise, it's 9 o'clock. I will draw us to a close. But thank you all for your contributions. And Keith, that was a real tour de force. Enjoyed it. A feast of mapping. I just love those big scale ordnance maps as well. So tremendous. And Keith's already mentioned his involvement with the HTT map thing. I know Peter, John Enor is here tonight. So he's involved in the project to cover Bath. And your society, CCS, is extremely likely to sponsor a chunk of that particular production, as we did in Alnwick. So we look forward to seeing that one. But Keith, once again, thank you so much. And hang on a minute, I'm going to click my own applause button. There we go. Thank you so much and appreciate it. And we'll talk again soon. And the next one's on me when you come to London.
I look forward to that. Thank you. Thanks, Jerry. Good to see you all. Thank you, everybody.
And good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Okay.
Cheers, all.